Hey everyone, so this video will be a little different from some others I've done in that it's a bit shorter. Reason being, you're going to have some videos that I want you to watch apart from this one, and I don't have the technology to try to embed those here, and that might be an issue with like copyright and these sorts of things anyway. So I would much rather you just watch those separately. And in fact, if you haven't already, it would be best if you go ahead and watch the two videos that I've put the links here, but you have them separately. The first is kind of an introduction to Parliament and the concept of Parliament. And then you have one that is really, I said presidential system intro here, but it's really more of a comparison between a parliamentary system and a presidential system. So once you kind of have those foundations, then you can come back here and pick up where we are now. So if you didn't already, pause, do that, come right back. Okay, so starting off, we look at a parliamentary system. And parliamentary systems, this is like it says, it's most democracies, and you find them, all over the world, particularly places where you may have had colonization from a place that had a parliamentary system. That doesn't happen all the time because, of course, the U.S. is not a parliamentary system; it's a presidential system, and it was colonized by the UK or Britain, which has a parliamentary system. So, what are the key features of a parliamentary system? Well, the first big one is that the prime minister is the one who directs the cabinet, and he is from the legislature. So, what this means is the prime minister is chosen straight from the legislature. He is himself a member of that parliament. So, in fact, in the UK, for example, they're called MPs, a member of parliament, and then one of those is chosen to be the prime minister, meaning like the top minister of parliament. And so he functions as both the head of government. Well, sorry, no, I almost went wrong there. He normally he can be a she, and in Britain up until recently was a she. So is the head of government running the day-to-day operations, but not the head of state because the head of state can be like a monarch. So Queen Elizabeth is technically the head of state in Britain, but no real power. So the prime minister is the most powerful member of a parliamentary system, and in some ways is more powerful than a president because he or she is going to be kind of tied directly to the legislature, meaning it's assumed he'll be on the same page as the legislature or the parliament. Okay, and like it says there, because the prime minister is not directly elected or by the people, but instead emerges from parliament, that means the prime minister will be the leader of the majority party. Or in the case that the parliament is broken up into multiple parties and no one has a clear majority, tends to be coming out of the largest party that's represented. Okay, so because the prime minister emerges from parliament himself, and at this point I'm just going to say himself, and that means that the parliament feels like they are able to put certain expectations on the prime minister as the leader of their party and then the leader of the parliamentary body. So because of this, although the prime minister is pretty powerful, he can also be pretty easily removed by what's called a vote of no confidence. The members of parliament look and they say, "Hey, we put you in this position with certain expectations, and then if you're not meeting those expectations, we can simply hold a vote of no confidence and remove you from power." Now, so doesn't mean that they would just do this kind of flippantly, meaning just like at a moment's notice or just at their whims. It would be taken seriously to have a vote of no confidence because, of course, if you put this person in power and then he doesn't do a good job, well, you're going to not look real great either if you just pull him out of power immediately. However, this is a much more easily pursued way of removing the head of government from power than what we'll see with a presidential system. So that's why we say easily removed. It's just a simple vote. And but also because the executive, in this case the prime minister, is not actually separate from parliament, but is himself a member of parliament, you don't really have that separation of powers idea, or we also call checks and balances, that we tend to find in a presidential system. In a presidential system, the different branches are at least intended to be fairly, what we would say discrete from each other, meaning separate from each other. And this means the president and his cabinet are going to be the executive branch, and then they can check the power of the other two branches, which would be the judicial branch and the legislative branch. So all three of those are seen to be somewhat autonomous. They do interact with each other, and there are ways that that power bleeds over, but they're supposed to be fairly independent from each other. In Parliament, there's not that same expectation because the Prime Minister is himself a member of Parliament, so he is both legislative and executive. And so some people feel like this leads to more effective government in terms of trying to get things done, but it does also result in a government that some would feel like is too powerful and doesn't have enough checks on it to kind of restrain it from maybe going overboard with some things it would look to do. Okay, next up we have presidential systems, which are not as common. They're still pretty prominent. We find them a lot of places, such as in the US and Latin America. In this case, the president is directly elected for a fixed term. In parliament, by the way, the length of term may not be so well defined. Usually it's kind of within certain bounds, but in a presidential system, you have a firm 4-year term, for example. And that figure is both the head of state and the head of government. And this point's a little harder to kind of wrap your brain around, but we would say that because the president is directly voted in by the people, at least in some sense, it's a national vote. In the US, the way that national vote happens is a little bit different, but it is still the people putting the president into power instead of him emerging out of the congressional branch. So, because of this, the president doesn't have to really concern himself with organizing the legislative branch in the same way that we find in a parliamentary system. He doesn't have to coalition build, we would say, meaning kind of coordinate these different parties to try to make things happen. That's just not part of the role. And so he's either going to be siding with a majority party, in which case they'll tend to get along, but it's still not up to him to run the legislature, or he may be antagonistic to the legislature if he is not part of the same party that has the majority of seats in the legislature. So notice that is a difference that can even happen. In a parliamentary system, the largest party will put forward the prime minister. And if it's the majority, they automatically will, the majority party is going to have the prime minister. In a presidential system, people could vote for Democratic senators and a Republican president. And so you would have a majority Congress that's Democratic, but a president who's Republican, which could definitely put them at odds. And at that point, he wouldn't see it as his goal to try to pass the legislation that the Congress wants to have. He would probably see himself looking to stand in their way from passing things they would attempt to do. Um, because the president is elected by the people and not by parliament, it is much harder to remove him from office. They can't just say, hey, we put you there, we can take you back out. Instead, to remove a president from power, there's what's called an impeachment process. Impeachment is a legal proceeding that attempts to remove a president from office. So Bill Clinton was impeached in my lifetime. What that meant is he had a legal charge brought against him to attempt to remove him from office. So he was impeached. He, however, was not removed from office because when they went through the process, ultimately, when the votes happened, which happened in the Senate, 55 senators voted to keep him in office and 45 voted to remove him. So the vote to keep him in won. And it was a whole, like trial essentially before it went to that vote. It wasn't just a simple thing. Okay, as I implied or talked about before, you have stronger separation of powers because these different branches operate separately from each other. The president is not actually part of the legislative branch. He can veto legislation that they put forward, but he's not a member himself. He's not expected to like lead that legislative body. And because you have these different branches that each want to protect their own power, this can cause divided or deadlocked government. If one really wants to do one thing and another wants to go their way, sorry about that, then it can lead to, yeah, to what we call a deadlocked government where they don't really seem to be getting much done. Um, Sometimes maybe you don't want a government to get much done. It's better to do nothing than to do something bad. But most people would prefer a government that is effective and able to, take care of what they ought to. So this would be a good time to pause your video because we are now going to look at semi-presidential systems. So if you can pause now and then watch that video and then pick up for the last bit I'll add on here. So picking up where we were, the last type of system we're looking at here is a semi-presidential system. Hopefully you checked out that video. And it is kind of the hardest one to really make sense of, but particularly because it can look different in different countries with different degrees of power that are given to the president and prime minister. And yep, we got a president and prime minister. It's a hybrid model where that power is divided between those two bodies with varying degrees of power. But in terms of what it tends to look like, the president is directly elected from the people. Obviously, there could be corruption in those elections, but the theory is he's directly elected by the people with a fixed term, and he is more the international figure. Sets forth policy, leads foreign policy, commander in chief, and represents the country internationally. So, would typically be thought of as the top figure. And then meanwhile, the president selects the prime minister. And so this person, however, is then subject to the confidence of the legislature. So the president puts a prime minister in the position of kind of coordinating and running the legislature, but the other members of the legislature could still express, displeasure at the way that that prime minister is running things. And he's taking kind of the agenda or policy put forth by the president, translating that into legislation and ensuring that it passes. So the president is able to kind of set what he wants to have happen, and then the prime minister attempts to move that forward. So two prominent models of the semi-presidential system. You have in France, most powers with the president, but the prime minister supports him. In Russia, the power really truly resides with the president, and which has been Putin, although unofficially at times, but largely Putin has been the guy kind of running the country. So, in any case, obviously this could create some problems if you wind up with disagreements between a president and prime minister, and but a lot of time they're able to make it work, especially because the president tends to appoint that prime minister, so going to tend to be someone who they tend to get along with. So this essentially wraps it up. I know the video that you watched went into more detail about these systems. Hopefully that was helpful, and I will see everybody soon.